Wonderful. I think we are leveling out now on numbers, so I'm going to go ahead and kick off, if that's okay with everyone. So we have one more. So hello and welcome to the first webinar of our HackHERHealth series. So this webinar marks the start of our ideation week, which is very exciting. And what better way to kick off than with the wonderful Sara Light and Julia Pfeiffer. So I wanted to introduce our speakers today. So firstly, we have Sara. So Sara is a pharmaceutical sales exec and leader of Think Neurodiversity Group at AstraZeneca. So in this role, Sara works to foster a neuro-inclusive culture within the company. And this includes activities like ensuring good policies that make employees thrive, and also supporting the development of opportunities to attract and retain neurodivergent talent. Sara is joined today by her daughter Julia. So Julia is a first-year student at Indiana University, a Wells Scholar, in fact, I should mention. A combination of autism, ADHD, and a lifelong fascination with the human mind has inspired her to pursue a degree in psychology. Though Julia has not stopped there, her passion of creative writing has also led her to double major in English, and she's currently working on a novel that explores the unique difficulties of autistic women navigating interpersonal conflicts and college life with a disability. So we're grateful to listen to you present today. Sara, I believe you have some slides, so if you can pull those up, I can hand straight over to you.
And Emily, thank you so much for having me and having Julia. This is exciting. And Julia, I love it. She's my daughter, and we can talk about this topic together, which has been very, very passionate. I'm very passionate about this topic. It's obviously near and dear to me. I want to start out by saying that obviously Julia and I are not experts. We're not clinicians. We do not diagnose, although sometimes I feel like I have a really good autism radar. But we're just here to share our experiences as, being neurodivergent women. Julia, since she is 18 years old, she's much closer to the population that you're wanting to find a solution for with this hackathon. And we're just so privileged to be here and be a part of this and just talk about this topic together. So I thought I'd go through a little bit of, about autism, ADHD, the current diagnostic criteria, the differences in boys and girls, and then why is it so important that you're doing what you're doing, coming up with solutions, but also to just hear from some of the everyday struggles to give you a better idea of, what it's like as autistic, as ADHD, and then go over a little bit of some of the language, and in the last half or however long for questions and answers, and questions for Julia or myself. I think Julia has, she's my daughter, so I'm very biased, but brilliant mind with, at times, has had some struggles growing up. And I think as when you're younger, those struggles are a little bit more pronounced. So it's great that she can be here and answer any questions that you may have. So I wanted to start off by just talking about neurodiversity. So like Emily said, I lead our Think Neurodiversity Employee Resource Group at AstraZeneca. So I am in contact with a lot of neurodivergent women, autistic women, ADHD women, all types of different neurotypes. And together with AstraZeneca, we have adopted this definition of neurodiversity, and we'll kind of go into why this is important a little bit later, but I just wanted to read it. So neurodiversity refers to the cognitive differences in how we think, learn, communicate, and process information as natural variations of the human brain. Neurodivergent conditions include, but are not limited to, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD. There are quite a few different neurocognitive profiles that are atypical. But this definition is important to our AstraZeneca company, and I think that's very similar to what you might see when you just Google neurodiversity, because it basically says that we are not broken, that we have a different variation, the way that there's variations in personality and eye color and hair color, and that it's normal. And so a few more terms. So neurodiversity, I just went over the definition, but it's important to know that it is a fact. It refers to the cognitive differences with our whole population, and it's natural. And that's the important thing about it, is that neurodiversity movement then highlights the fact that different is normal and variety is good. And so there's this neurodiversity movement that was actually brought on by the autism movement. And so it first started with autistics. It's obviously because if you are autistic, there's a great likelihood that you have another neurodivergent condition. And so it's, neurodiversity then, or being neurodivergent, encompasses many different conditions since they are so common to be co-occurring. But it's a social justice movement. That seeks civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for the neurodivergent. And so then if you are neurodivergent, within neurodiversity, we have some labels that refer to people who are in the minority of the whole population. And those labels are currently defined by what people can't do. So if dyslexia, I can't read or write. ADHD, I can't focus my attention. Autism, I can't effectively communicate in the same way others do. So neural minorities then have been empowered through the neurodiversity movement. They've gained self-confidence, ownership of our identities through accepting that our brains are different and that difference is okay. So that is important to go over the fact that if you are diagnosed autistic, you are not broken. Now there are strategies, and the world might not be created for you. And it's created for people that are neurotypical, but that you're not broken. And so I just wanted to go over that to highlight the importance of that. And looking at autism and ADHD, I kind of highlighted just a summary. This is more complex than what is shown here, but autism spectrum disorder. So you may have heard it as autism spectrum condition in the UK. That's how they discuss it. We like that because taking out the word disorder, no one wants to see that word. Usually we refer to it as autistic. I'm autistic. I have autism. It's also known as Asperger's syndrome. So, we no longer use that term. It was taken away and everybody is now included under the autism spectrum disorder profile. But if you were diagnosed with Asperger's, you'll find that there are people that still refer to that term. They call themselves an Aspie. So that's kind of some of the language that's used for autism. I'll probably just refer to it as autism throughout. But and with the diagnostic criteria, you must display social communication and interaction differences across multiple contexts, and they have to begin in childhood. And that is very important when you're going through the diagnostic process. So there's differences in social emotional reciprocity. So for example, reduced back and forth conversation compared to the norm. There's differences in nonverbal communication, so reduced eye contact or body language compared to the norm. And there's differences in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, difficulty adjusting to different social contexts, and also the presence of distinct patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. So to receive a diagnosis, you must have clinically significant symptoms in all of these areas. When you look at ADHD in the purple, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you may notice, we all notice as ADHDers, that the words deficit and disorder, and same thing with autism spectrum disorder. We don't necessarily like to refer to it that way, but that is the medical model and that is how we are diagnosed. But there are three types: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive or compulsive, and then a combined type where you present with both. Most autistic women who have co-occurrence of ADHD present with the inattentive type. And so that's what I listed, basically the summary for that. So what is tested and what you are diagnosed with is this checklist: makes careless mistakes, lack of attention to detail, difficulty sustaining attention, does not seem to listen when spoken to directly, fails to follow through on tasks and instructions, exhibits poor organization, avoids or dislikes tasks requiring sustained mental effort, loses things necessary for tasks and activities, easily distracted, is forgetful in daily activities. So ADHD has this stereotype of visible hyperactivity. You may think, or people often do think, of school-aged boys who aren't able to sit in their seat. They're constantly getting in trouble. Research, however, suggests that only 25% of ADHD in children present as outwardly hyperactive, and only 5% of adults. So as you age, it used to be believed that ADHD was something that was a childhood disorder and that you would grow out of it, and it occurred only in boys. We know that that is now not true. And I think the way that I would say about my own ADHD is that hyperactivity is actually very, very true. It's just internalized. So there's a lot going on in my mind. I used to describe it as, I have 5 TVs going on with 5 different television shows or news stations, and I'm constantly trying to follow and figure out which one that needs my attention, and it can be overwhelming at times. Medication for me has very much helped for me to focus and be able to watch just that one television. But it is a constant struggle of balancing my attention. So these are just kind of a summary. I think that Emily or the hackathon team has provided the diagnostic criteria for both, but just wanted to summarize both here. And everything that I'm speaking to today, I'm using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, the DSM-5. I know that's used in the United States, which is where Julia and I are from. But I do believe that a lot of countries, other countries, use it as well, and come up with their diagnostic criteria based on that DSM-5. So in the US, and it is the Bible of psychiatric diagnosis. And so autism is diagnosed, all right, keep doing that. Autism is diagnosed primarily based on social and communication differences and repetitive patterns of behavior, whereas ADHD is diagnosed based on attentional differences. So according to the DSM, there are no overlapping traits between the two. And that makes sense for someone who has both autism and ADHD. It's difficult at times to tease out which condition is causing which symptoms. But if you look at it in those terms, the diagnostic criteria classifies outward observable traits. It doesn't reflect the internal experience. And so that there are no overlapping traits between the two, if you think of it in that way. The DSM, though, it lists for ADHD 18 diagnostic criteria. So I've only listed kind of a summary here. Clinicians use this to identify symptoms. Insurance companies use it to determine coverage, at least in the United States. Research uses it to determine areas of worthwhile study. So it's widely known that the DSM criteria for ADHD really only fits the elementary school-aged child and has never been validated for people over the age of 16. So getting an ADHD diagnosis later in life and as an adult is very, very difficult. And we're going to go into a little bit of why. But up until 2013, people couldn't be diagnosed with both. So you couldn't have a diagnosis of autism and a diagnosis of ADHD. You couldn't do that until 2013. And that is also the year that the DSM went from the 4th to the 5th edition, and they took out the Asperger's syndrome as the diagnostic criteria and lumped it into the autism spectrum disorder diagnosis that we see now. So even though autism and ADHD are co-occurring and they're very, very common together, you couldn't have a diagnosis of both. So it was very limiting. There was a study done Duke University, I believe in 2012, that showed that up to half of people who are diagnosed as autistic also exhibit ADHD symptoms, and the characteristics of autism are present in 2/3 of people with ADHD. So it was that prominent study, and amongst others and other clinicians, that said that, hey, there's a lot of overlap here. There's a lot of people that are exhibiting both, and they changed that criteria. So for the purposes of just this talk, this is a summary, and it is very, very much lacking. We're missing a lot of girls with ADHD diagnosis and with autism diagnosis. But with ADHD specifically, it's because most present with that inattentive type. And the kids who are hyperactive and disruptive in class, they're going to get noticed, and they're often referred to for diagnosis. But a clinician's understanding of ADHD and autism, a lot of them only have about a half of a day training in each. So it's interesting that like a psychotherapist or a psychologist or a clinician who is treating mental health disorders, they don't have a ton of a training on this unless they seek it out. And that is what I found in my experience with talking to other people at AstraZeneca who are autistic. That was experience with Julia. So Julia, my daughter, she went through all of school and never had any teacher or anyone else say, hey, I think there's something going on here. So she went until her preteen years with no diagnosis, and really no teacher that ever raised a flag that said maybe you should get a diagnosis. There was one teacher in first grade that made a comment that Julia seems to not be paying attention at times. I'm noticing that she doesn't pay attention, but then when I call on her, she always knows the answer. She was always very well behaved. She was quiet. She was studious. She was a rule follower. And so it never raised a red flag. And we find that is very, very common with girls, with women, with both of these conditions. So I wanted to go a little bit into some of the overlooked features of ADHD. So more modern research that has been published specifically by Dr. William Dotson, who is a thought leader in ADHD and ADHD in women and girls. He kind of goes over some of the overlooked features of ADHD. Trying to build out the slide, but it's not building. Okay, sorry about that. Technical difficulties.
Could you possibly stop sharing and then reshare at all? Is it showing up on your screen?
It's not sharing. Let me see.
I think we were discussing shortly before this that it's always the way.
There's always something. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Apologies for this. Okay.
Yeah, brilliant.
So some of the core overlooked features of ADHD, Dr. Dotson goes into depth about this, but that ADHD is an interest-based nervous system. And this is why girls are being missed, is because this is not as known with clinicians and it's not as studied, but if you do so, then you can catch more people because you're looking at ADHD in a different way. It's not necessarily just about attention. So despite its name, ADHD doesn't actually cause a deficit of attention. It causes inconsistent attention. It's only activated under certain circumstances. So most people, including clinicians, have only a vague understanding of ADHD and what that means, and they equate it to hyperactivity, like I said, and poor focus, and mostly in children. But when you think about an interest-based nervous system, you often hear of ADHDers saying that they get into a zone or they hit a groove, and this is describing their state of hyperfocus. And that's, you'll see a lot of parents that say, wait, my child who has ADHD can pay attention, and they spend a lot of attention, but it's just on the things that are not getting done, like chores. It's on video games or whatever they're interested in. That's just because that's going to show that it's an interest-based nervous system, and that attention, you need the interest to require sustained attention. Stimulant medication is very good at keeping the ADHD brain from getting distracted. So once they're engaged, it doesn't help you engage in the first place, but that is why stimulant medication is the first step to helping people with ADHD. I know for myself, it was amazing when I was able to have access to that medication. So that's what diagnosis will do for ADHD. The next thing is an emotional hyperarousal. So research suggests this area of ADHD is more pronounced in teenage and adult women. So people with ADHD have passionate thoughts and emotions that are more intense than those of the average person. Their highs are higher, their lows are lower. And this means that you may experience both happiness and criticism more powerfully than your peers and loved ones do. And so many ADHDers, especially girls, are first misdiagnosed with a mood disorder. That was the case with Julia. And she can maybe go into a little bit more when she's going to talk. But on average, the adult, if you're not diagnosed as a child and it's an older diagnosis, on average, adults will see 2.3 clinicians and go through 6.6 antidepressant trials before being diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. So it's often diagnosed first as anxiety or depression. But what we know and what modern research has found is that it's more emotional hyperarousal. And then the last core feature, which I think for me personally is the most, I would say, disabling aspect of ADHD, is called rejection sensitive dysphoria. It is, so the Greek, it stems from the Greek word meaning unbearable. So dysphoria is unbearable. And I'd say it's pretty accurate at that time. So RSD is an intense vulnerability to the perception, not necessarily the reality, of being rejected, teased, or criticized by important people in your life. So rejection sensitivity is characterized by intense mood shifts triggered by a distinct episode caused by one of the following: rejection, either real or perceived, from the people that you love or that you respect or you need approval from. It can be spurred on by teasing, criticism, no matter how constructive it is, and persistent self-criticism prompted by your own perceived failure. So it comes on very quickly, it comes on passionately, and then it leaves. And so girls who internalize the emotional response to RSD, they can look like they have depression or extreme anxiety or withdraw. But this is a very characteristic aspect of ADHD, this rejection sensitive dysphoria. I have not met a person with ADHD that doesn't talk about this. It's great that they've finally began to study it in more depth and talk about it. But even though that emotional dysregulation and rejection sensitivity are old concepts, there hasn't been a published research started up until about 5 years ago. It's hard to measure, and so it continues to be left out of the criteria in the United States. I do believe that the UK has added it as one of its 6 fundamental features in diagnosing. But this is probably the most misunderstood aspect of ADHD and the most debilitating for me personally. So moving on back over to autism, and I kind of put together some of the latest statistics of autism in girls and what why is there this difference, and some of the statistics related to that difference. So with girls, there is an increased risk of victimization. They're less likely to present with social communication deficits. They are more likely to have co-occurring internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression, eating disorders, self-harm. They're more likely to mask social communication differences. There is currently that is estimated that the real statistic, the real prevalence is 3 to 4 female to male ratio, not 1 to 4, which is currently diagnosed. And there's a mathematical study that was published last year that predicts that 80% of autistic girls remain undiagnosed at the age of 18, which is staggering and scary. But the whole population prevalence is about 2 to 4%. And if you look at female autistics who have intellectual disability, if you look at both female and male, there's a 1 to 2 ratio there. But then with autistics with above average IQ, the ratio of current diagnosis is 1 to 9. So we are obviously missing a lot of people. And there was the most recent study that was published in January that looked at the current gold standard, which is the ADOS test. This is the test that Julia was also diagnosed with. Excuse me. It measured an autism diagnosis. It does have a bias towards the male manifestation of autism. It reviewed, excuse me, it reviewed thousands of published research and current testing models, excuse me. So it reviewed all of the tests that are currently given, all of the published research, and there's definitely a bias towards the male expression. It showed that the underdiagnosis of females are due to a different expression of autistic symptoms compared to males, and therefore not meeting current diagnostic criteria. So they did find that females use more compensation and masking camouflage strategies than males and deliberately inhibit their ASD-related behaviors. So due to this, there's longer delays for diagnosis and support. There's greater marginalization experiences, loss of social and support and understanding. And females are at a greater vulnerability to physical and mental health. From Julia and our family, myself, my brother, my father, there's all these autistic traits there that we've seen. Julia is the first to go through the diagnostic process. Like I said earlier, no one spurred that on, no teacher, no one else said anything. It was when she started exhibiting mental health and some depression and really questioning who she was that as a parent, I had done thousands of hours researching my own differences. And so that is what, I knew that she was autistic. She didn't have that label, but she started questioning why she was so different. We started down that process. She eventually went to an autism center to get diagnosed, but all they did was diagnose and look at autism. That's it. They didn't look at any depression scores. They didn't look at ADHD. They didn't test her for anything else. They just tested her for autism. And so that is part of the reason why girls are missed, is because what they're presenting with most at the moment, and that's probably depression by the time life becomes very challenging, that is what is focused on by clinicians. And so they'll try antidepressants and different disorders. So they're often diagnosed with so many different things prior to getting their real diagnosis and access to support and resources. And also one of the key things with Julia's diagnosis as a parent, once she got that diagnosis, there wasn't really anything that was offered after that. Basically, what they had told me was, you've done a good job at teaching Julia some ways to operate in the world. So she probably wouldn't qualify, or it wouldn't have her to do our peer-to-peer programs. It's often for people that don't have great social skills. And so here, read a few books, and you may want to take her to counseling to help with mental health. That was about all that we were given as far as support after she had gone through that diagnosis. So that's kind of, I think also that clinicians aren't super confident in autism. It was very difficult to find someone to even perform a diagnosis of Julia. I know myself, I've never even tried to start that diagnostic process because of, what Julia, she was so worried that she wouldn't even get the diagnosis because she was masking so well. So I think that it's important that clinicians use like a battery of tests. I wanted to briefly just say that when we talk about autism and people think of autism as a spectrum, this is what they tend to think. So they think, oh, there's this line, and there's autistics who are a little quirky, and then maybe they show more symptoms, so they're definitely autistic. And then if they're even more symptomatic, they're tragically autistic. But this spectrum doesn't go from low to high. We've tried to stop using the functioning labels, so saying high functioning autism or the other end of the spectrum, because this is not what they're talking about when they say autism spectrum. It's not a line from low to high and you fall somewhere in there. What autism as a spectrum actually means is that there's all of these different traits. It's a collection of strengths and struggles and experiential variables, and they're different for every individual, and they're going to be different. You might have, an individual might have struggles more with pragmatic language, so their ability to socially communicate, use body language, have eye contact, small talk. Females, we know, are much better at this, so they don't struggle maybe as much with that. But then they're going to struggle more with the monotropic mindset of being obsessed only in their own interests or being able to move from one task to the next. And so I wanted to reframe autism as this is more of the spectrum that they're speaking about, and this is what we talk about when we say autism is a spectrum. This is just two different profiles of what that could mean, where you have strengths and challenges in different areas. But if you could kind of reframe that, we don't say anymore she's a high functioning autistic, he's a low functioning autistic, because they are fully autistic. Everyone who's diagnosed with autism, they're autistic, and they struggle maybe with different areas, but they're all autistic. This is a chart that I gave Emily that is very good. This was not around when Julia was going through her diagnosis. It was just published in 2020 by Dr. Donna Henderson, who has 20 years experience diagnosing autistics and autistic women. But she goes through the DSM criteria, and I'm not going to go through all of it. This is a resource that you have access to, but really what she has done is given the less obvious presentation, that's what she calls, for every single one of the diagnostic criteria. So if you look at just the first one in the DSM-5, you have to show, have a diagnosis of autism, you have to show difference in reciprocating social or emotional interactions. What people think of, and even clinicians have been trained, is that they have a complete lack of reciprocity and empathy, and they're disengaged. If you have more training, you understand that it actually includes differences with responding to their names, offering a greeting, responding to greetings, initiating conversation, conversing about a variety of topics, knowing when it's your turn to talk and someone else's turn to talk, monologuing or interrupting, responding to praise, picking up social breadcrumbs. So when people say things and those unwritten rules of communication, that is what is really included in when they're talking about this criteria. And then you have the female presentation, where they might exhibit better functional social behavior than autistics with obvious or traditional presentations. So they camouflage more skillfully well into adulthood, and they can be more engaged and chatty. Their reciprocity is more natural when talking about their social interests. and they can kind of fake it a little bit better. We learn those skills as women. What they've found through studies is that women naturally better at socializing when you look at female versus male. And so Donna Henderson then created this chart that's been immediately picked up by the community that diagnoses autism, to use this to better catch more females when they're going through the diagnosis, just because they exhibit it differently. It is well researched now in the last 10 years that the female autistic will present differently. So it goes through this criterion. Obviously, read this on your own, but it is really important to look at the way the female presents. The female presentation is just going to be much different than a male presentation. And when it comes to sensory differences, which is one of the key aspects of autism, they tend to have more severe sensory disruptions. And so I'm going to turn this part over to Julia, because she can go through what a complex sensory profile can look like with autistics. And since she has most of these, or all of these actually, she can tell you like her experience of what it's like. So Julia.
Yeah, hi. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the complex sensory profile that can go along with autism, and I'm going to be referencing my personal experiences throughout. So while many people might be aware that autism comes with differences in interpreting, processing, and reacting to sensory input, I think not everyone realizes that there are more than 5 senses. So sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Autistic people definitely have sensitivities to these. But as an autistic person, I also face unique challenges in relation to vestibular sense, proprioception, and interoception. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about what those are. Vestibular sense and proprioception are very similar and often confused, but there are small differences between them. So vestibular sense is the sense of where your body is in space, and it manifests in a person's balance, coordination, and movement of their body. It tells you whether you are moving or standing still and how fast you're going. And the vestibular system is in your inner ear. It has to do with gravity. So for instance, if you went to the moon, your vestibular input would be totally different, and it would take your body time to adjust to that. And so autistic people some of them are a little bit less attuned to their vestibular sense. And experiences that can potentially throw off your vestibular system are sometimes avoided by autistic people, such as going on roller coasters or sitting in a ski lift with your feet just hanging in the air. This can cause people systems to go completely out of whack, even though logically you know that you're safe and everything. And then I, on the other hand, I actually seek out vestibular stimulation. So I really enjoy going on roller coasters. I was scared of them when I was younger, but now I do. And in middle school, we had a swing set in our backyard, and I would swing on it for 3 hours straight after school just because I enjoy the sensation of being in the air. And then another example, so autistic individuals display sensory seeking behaviors, and one common example that a lot of people are familiar with is rocking back and forth, and this is something that engages the vestibular sense. So then proprioception, on the other hand, is the sense of where our body parts are in relation to each other and to other objects. Someone who struggles with proprioception might fail to touch their index fingers together on the first try, especially without looking at their hands, because they don't have a great sense of where their body parts are. And they might have poor or unusual posture. So, for example, when I did cross country for a couple years, I was told by many different people that I had a very strange running gait, like I had a very weird stride, which is something that could be attributed to proprioception. And proprioception can also affect someone's ability to judge the amount of force needed to hold or pick up objects. Autistic people might accidentally slam the door without realizing it, or press down too hard when writing and break their pencil lead because they don't have a great sense of proprioception. And these two senses overlap in many ways. It's common in autistic individuals to frequently bump into walls, people, or other objects. When I walk through the dining halls on campus, there are chairs scattered everywhere, and I run into them all the time. And this can be related to either sense. For me, the issues seem to stem from a poor sense of proprioception. I misjudge the distance between myself and the chair. But for someone struggling with vestibular sense more, it could be that they have no problem understanding the amount of space between themselves and their obstacles, and running into things maybe more to do with an inability to control their movements because of balance. Or it could also be a combination of both. And then interoception is even less commonly spoke about and understood. Interoception is one's ability to be in touch with what's going on in their body. So when you're hungry, thirsty, tired, in pain, etc., your body gives you cues. And from my conversations with neurotypical people in my life, I've gotten the impression that many people who have a normally functioning sense of interoception are confused when I try to explain it, because these things come so naturally that they don't even think about having a good or poor sense of interoception. But some autistic people really struggle with this. My body doesn't always tell me when I need to eat or drink water, and this has led to a chronic battle with dehydration that I'm still trying to create habits to solve, as well as frequent bouts of not eating for days or eating way too much food. And I've heard of autistic people being hospitalized for this because it gets to a point that's so extreme that they just don't know how to take care of their body. And also, while I knew that some autistic people struggle with not knowing when to use the bathroom, which can lead to completely unexpected accidents, even for adults, I thought this didn't apply to me at all until I spoke to someone who told me that not everyone has to check whether they need to go to the bathroom. And the answer for most people when they ask themselves this question is never, I'm not sure. So I think even for autistic people who are more aware of the limitations of their senses, sometimes we don't realize what's normal for us might not be normal for most people. And my struggles with interoception have led me to develop a sort of checklist in my head that I refer to whenever I'm feeling generally unwell and have no idea why. So, like, have I eaten a real meal today? Have I drunk water? Have I moved around? Have I been outside? Have I gotten enough sleep? Sometimes it's just, oh, I needed to take off my jacket because I was too hot. And so for neurotypical people, or even for autistic people who don't struggle with this is something that sounds a little bit absurd, but for people like me, or people who have, or who are even less in touch with their interoception, examining things like this and coming up with solutions could be really helpful. And sometimes manually inspecting these possible culprits of physical discomfort is enough to fix the issue, but sometimes I am so out of touch with my body that even focusing on it leaves me wondering, am I hungry? And I really can't tell. So in addition to these three lesser known senses, the sensory toolbox, so to say, of autistic individuals can be atypical in other ways. So conditions such as alexithymia, prosopagnosia, and synesthesia often occur alongside autism, although they don't have to, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. And I have variations of all three. So starting with alexithymia, while interoception is related to internal stimulus, this sense doesn't include less tangible sensations such as feelings and emotions, and this is where alexithymia comes into play. So it's a little similar. It's a condition in which a person has difficulty or a complete inability to recognize their emotions, label and communicate them to others, and assess patterns in them over time, such as whether they are usually happy or sad and why they might be feeling this way. I'm able to identify my feelings to an extent, and I'm usually aware of whether I'm doing good or bad, but a lot of the time I conceptualize emotions as comfortable or uncomfortable rather than being able to pinpoint exactly what I'm feeling. Or I think in terms of how much energy I have, so whether I feel drained or energized, and both of these things are common in alexithymia and in autistic people. When I was struggling with depression and anxiety in my early high school years, I realized I wasn't able to accurately conceptualize my change in emotions over time. So when I was very sad and empty during the lows of my depression, I could not remember what it felt like to be happy or when I last felt joy, and I certainly couldn't imagine a reality where I experienced happiness again. Conversely, once I felt better, I questioned whether I was really struggling with mental health at all because I couldn't relate to those bad feelings anymore. And I was also unable to estimate at all about how much of the last few months I'd felt bad versus good. So my therapist at the time proposed that I use an app called Dailyo, which is a mood journal that you can use to track your mood on a scale from 1 to 5 anytime you want, as many times per day as you feel like. And I've been using this app every day since the beginning of 2021. It's been helpful in looking at the overarching trend in my emotions. My average mood is significantly higher than it was in 2021 when I was dealing with mental health issues, but I still have trouble each time I enter my mood deciding exactly how I feel and remembering what a 5 is on a scale of 1 to 5 and how I felt each time I logged a 2 or a 4 in the last few years. So while it is helpful, it's a helpful tool, it doesn't completely solve the issues that I have with that. Another condition that I have is prosopagnosia, which is the difficulty or inability to recognize faces and picture them in your head. With this one as well, I have a milder variation and I can recognize and picture the faces of many of the people in my life, whereas some people have no ability to do this at any point throughout their life. However, for me, when I meet new people, it can take me much longer than the average person to begin to be able to recognize them. So there are many times in my life where I have met people and not realized that I'd met them before, or I've gotten people confused. And people with this condition often rely on distinguishing characteristics, and some people have recounted being alarmed or confused when someone gets a haircut and they're no longer able to recognize them. Personally, I watch a lot of TV shows in my spare time, but unless I'm with other people, I rarely watch movies. And this is because unless the cast is full of actors that I'm already familiar with, I have a lot of trouble keeping the characters straight until well into the film, which can lead to a lot of confusion about the plot. So I wouldn't say that this is something that that has a great effect on my life, but it is interesting that in TV shows this isn't as much of a problem because after the first couple episodes I get used to the faces and can fully enjoy the show for seasons to come. That's a bit about prosopagnosia. And then finally, synesthesia. I think this is a little bit more familiar to people. Some people have heard of it. It's a condition found in a variety of people, but it is notably common in neurodivergent people. And synesthesia is described as the crossing over of sensory pathways. So I have grapheme color synesthesia, meaning that I see numbers, letters, and words in color. And I believe this is why I have a fascination for certain words and names, and it contributes to why I have an excellent memory for things that I've read. So it can be a benefit in some cases. And I'd say that it adds beauty to my world, and I feel a little bit bad for people who don't see words in color. It's just part of who I am and how I see the world. And there are over 70 types of synesthesia. So people might see colors or shapes when they hear sounds or when they smell or taste certain things. There's also something called mirror touch synesthesia, where a person with this experiences physical sensations when they see someone else in pain or experiencing physical contact. And as I described, I feel like this enhances the way I see the world, but you can see with some of these more vivid examples, like hearing or seeing colors with sound or feeling other people's pain, you can see how all of these sensory differences could complicate everyday life for autistic people especially and contribute to sensory overload. So already struggling with understanding unwritten social rules that everyone else seems to know instinctively, these sensory differences can make life very difficult or even at times disabling. I think you're on mute still.
Thanks. I think we'll probably stop there for now. I realize because of the time that if you want to ask any questions, especially to Julia, so we can go finish up.
Yes, thank you so much. I think I'll go ahead and speak for everyone and say we're super grateful for your openness during that presentation. I know you shared at the start that this is your perspective, this is your experiences, and I know that that takes a lot to come and share that with us. So thank you so much. Got some applauses coming through in the reactions. So I'll just ask if there's any questions in the chat, or indeed if you would like to come off mute, then you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Let me. Okay, Amin, I think we can come to you for question.
Hello, everyone. Actually, I don't have any specific question. Just want to say thank you to Sara and Julia for sharing their experience, and it was great to hear them and get much more know to different views of this issue, actually. So thank you, both of you.
Yeah, thank you, Amin.
Lovely, and some thank yous in the chat as well. I might just, while I've got the mic, I might just quickly say that the full challenge write-ups for all our challenges will be released by the end of the day today. And I think Sarah also referred before to some of these resources that Sarah and others have kindly helped put together. So we also will release some resources for you to read through. And I'm sure during this week, if you don't have questions now, they'll come up during the week, and we have a wonderful panel of mentors that will be able to answer some of those questions for you later on. I think we have just a quick question in the chat now. So from Sophia, she said, thank you for sharing. She was wondering, what are some of the biggest benefits of having the diagnosis?
Julia, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, talk about this a little from my perspective. So like my mom mentioned, after my autism diagnosis, I wouldn't say that there were a lot of resources necessarily that were presented at the time, but having that diagnosis, it gave me an identity in a time where I was feeling very confused and isolated about the way that I saw the world. So it was something to tell me that I wasn't just weird or broken. And it helped me really separate the things that I actually needed to work on or improve about myself from the aspects of my personality that were just a part of me. And all of this, I think, contributed to the improvement of my mental health. And I think that awareness and education about the differences between autistic people and neurotypical people are very important. And then even after my autism diagnosis, I still felt like there was something missing. And about a year later, I was diagnosed with ADHD, which was instrumental in helping me become a healthier person mentally after struggling for so long, emotionally and with an increasing amount of schoolwork and social expectations. It was really hard at the time to feel motivated to do anything until my ADHD diagnosis gave me access to stimulant medication. And after that, I was able to bring some of my grades up by 2 full letter grades with the newfound ability to focus my motivation. And in addition to that, my mood changed drastically, practically overnight. I was still using Dailyo to track my mood, and it was astronomical, the difference before and after medication, because like my mom said, a lot of people with ADHD or autism can be misdiagnosed or just diagnosed with mood disorders. I would say that my diagnoses of depression and anxiety weren't misdiagnoses, but the medication that I was being treated with at the time, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, weren't really making much of a difference in comparison to the stimulant medication, which definitely improved my mood overnight just because I now felt capable to handle the challenges that I was facing.
Fantastic. And then I think we have a question from Gahad as well. So if I can come to you to ask your question. Oh, perhaps it was an accidental hand up. The hand's gone down, so perhaps, you have the ability to unmute yourself, Gahad, if you would like. Perhaps not. You're also welcome to use the chat as well if the microphone is not working for you. Any other questions before we wrap up today? No? Okay, well, thank you very much again for your great insights. Could not unmute. Sorry about that. Always the way.
Emily, to further answer that question, you know, Julia gave her perspective, and as a mom, I saw a huge difference when she had the diagnosis, first of autism and then of ADHD, and just huge difference in how she saw herself. And most people would say a diagnosis then equates to support or equates to resources. And yes, that's important, but these are just little bits and pieces of what people in the AstraZeneca neurodivergent community have said about their diagnosis. And it just is more internal about what happens on the inside, reframing who you are because you feel so different your whole life, and then understanding why, looking back at your childhood and teenage years. So these are some of the comments from them.
I remember I was speaking to someone on this, and they kind of said, actually, all the dots kind of connected. I understood, you know, thought back to sort of memories I had or experiences I had, and I realized exactly why I was feeling those things or was confused in that moment. So thank you for sharing. And okay, in the last 2 minutes, so the question was, so apologies about not being able to unmute you. I wanted to ask Julia, so again coming to you, if she could do one thing for girls with ADHD or ASD tomorrow, what would that be? Quite a big question, so.
That is a big question. One thing that I was sort of thinking about when we mentioned earlier in the presentation high and low functioning labels for autistic people, I was thinking one big reason that we've tried to do away with those labels is that they sort of externalize the problem, and people are often labeled high functioning when their disorder is less of a burden for other people rather than based on how it affects them. And I think the same can be true with ADHD, even when we don't use those labels. Kind of like my teachers mentioned that I was never a problem to have in class, and that was why no one ever sought out a diagnosis for me until I started struggling with mental health. And so if there was one thing I could do for girls with ADHD and autism tomorrow or today or anytime, it would be to maybe change the mindset of parents and teachers and society in general to think about it more along the lines of, is there something going on that maybe doesn't affect anyone else, but is just an internal struggle for the person themselves? And maybe that would help some of the people that are going without diagnosis.
Great, thank you so much. I think a great call out there at the end for some support tools, which is exactly what we're looking for. And we've got an awesome thanks, so a great answer to a big question. Fantastic. So that marks time. So I'll close up now and say again, thank you very much for joining us today. We have some other sessions later today and later on in the week as well, all the way up to our kickoff on Friday. So feel free to check out your emails and also the website as well if you want to see when they are taking place. But yeah, see you all soon at the weekend, and yeah, have a lovely rest of day.